Just imagine for a second, you're there, once again being humiliated, disrespected, completely trampled on by that person who thinks they're the center of the universe. The narcissist looks at you with that cynical and cruel smile, expecting you to explode, to lose control, to transform into exactly what they want you to be. A desperate victim crawling and begging for crumbs of respect and dignity. But what if I told you there's a way to completely turn this game around? What if you could not only protect yourself from these manipulative creatures, but put that narcissist exactly where they deserve to be, completely powerless before your newly discovered inner strength? What you're about to discover in this video aren't gentle self-help techniques that everyone already knows. These are absolutely devastating psychological tactics that Freud knew over a century ago, cruel and precise strategies that will transform you from prey into an emotional predator. Because it's time to stop being an emotional doormat and start being the absolute master of your own destiny. Every tactic I'm going to reveal has been tested in the brutal cruelty of real life, in situations where people like you were being emotionally destroyed by narcissists. Some of these tactics will shock you with their brutal simplicity and devastating effectiveness. Others will make you angrily question why the hell nobody ever taught you this before, why you had to suffer so much before discovering these psychological weapons. Before I hand you these devastating weapons, you need to understand exactly how the twisted mind of your enemy works. Freud discovered something that most people don't know. Narcissists aren't confident people. They're terrified creatures hiding behind a mask of arrogance. Underneath all that disgusting arrogance, there's a scared and insecure child who has a mortal terror of being discovered as the fraud they really are. This discovery by Freud is the key to destroying them completely, because when you know where the wound is, you know exactly where to apply pressure to cause maximum psychological damage. The narcissistic brain functions like an emotional vampire. It constantly needs to suck validation, attention, and emotional reactions from other people to stay psychologically alive. Without this energy source, they literally begin to enter mental collapse. This is exactly what you're going to use against them. From now on, you'll understand that every scream, every humiliation, every attempt to make you feel small is actually a desperate cry for attention coming from a pathetic creature who is dying of fear of being ignored. And when you understand this, everything changes. Now tell me something quick. What city are you watching this from? Because this psychological warfare you're about to learn works anywhere in the world, and you're going to need this strength for what's coming. Because the first tactic I'm going to teach you is so devastating it can break a narcissist in a matter of seconds, leaving them completely lost and desperate. The first tactic is so psychologically devastating it can break a narcissist in a matter of seconds. Treat them as if they were completely irrelevant to your existence, not as an enemy you hate, not as someone who hurts you, but as someone who simply doesn't exist in your emotional universe. Let me explain the brutal science behind this. Freud discovered that the narcissistic ego feeds exclusively on emotional reactions. When you scream, cry, defend yourself, or attack back, you're literally feeding their inner beast. It's like giving fuel to a fire you should be putting out. But when you look at the narcissist with the same completely empty facial expression, you'd look at a wall with absolutely devoid of any emotion. Something psychologically devastating happens in their sick brain. The part that processes rewards and validation simply enters total collapse. It's like you've turned off their main power system. Here's the cruelest secret of all. Narcissists prefer to be intensely hated rather than ignored with indifference. Hatred is still a form of recognition that feeds their sick ego, but total indifference, that's literally psychological death for these creatures. In brutal practice, it works exactly like this. When they speak, you look through them as if they were transparent. When they provoke with their venomous words, you respond with a completely disinterested, Dumb. When they try to humiliate you in public in front of other people, you simply continue your conversation as if they hadn't said absolutely anything. The narcissist will escalate the provocations desperately, will try everything within their reach to get an emotional reaction, but you remain unshakable like a solid rock in the middle of a furious storm. And slowly, cruelly, you'll see desperation grow in their eyes, frustration take over, the realization that they've lost all power over you. But this is just the beginning. The second tactic is even more psychologically brutal. This second tactic is so powerful, it can make a narcissist question their own sanity, completely remove the power of their words over you. Don't just ignore like in the first tactic. Emotionally deactivate everything they say as if it were irritating background noise. Freud called this neutralization of the emotional catheter. What does this mean in practice? Simple and brutal. You're going to train your brain to process the narcissist's venomous words like you'd process the sound of cars passing in the street, something that exists in the environment but doesn't deserve even a second of your conscious attention. The devastating secret is in instant and automatic reinterpretation. When the narcissist insults you with their cruelest words, your mind immediately translates internally, wounded person desperately trying to feel better. When they criticize you destructively, you automatically think, pathetic insecurity being projected onto me. When they humiliate you publicly, you internally smile, thinking, what a pathetic and desperate creature. Here's the cruelest part of this tactic. You're going to do this while maintaining a completely neutral expression on your face, as if you were watching a boring television show. The narcissist will talk, desperately trying to find the right emotional wound to hurt and control you. But it's like they're shooting at a ghost. Nothing hits, nothing hurts, nothing matters. Neuroscience confirms that we can literally train our brain not to process certain information as real threats. This is exactly what you're going to do. Completely reprogram your emotional system to treat the narcissist as an irritating malfunction of reality, not as a real person with any kind of power over your inner peace. And here's the psychological coup de grace. After a few pathetic and frustrated attempts to hit you emotionally, you look at them with a slightly confused expression and ask with total sincerity, "Sorry, were you talking to me?" As if you hadn't even paid attention to anything that came out of their mouth. But wait until you discover the third tactic. This one will make you understand why some narcissists develop complete psychotic episodes when they encounter someone who really knows how to play this psychological game. The third tactic is psychologically brutal and devastating. You're going to completely reverse the narrative of the situation, transforming the narcissist from powerful predator into a pathetic and unstable character who arouses pity and concern. Freud observed with precision that narcissists build absolutely their entire distorted identity around a false image of superiority and control. They desperately need to see themselves as the powerful protagonists of their life story. But what if you completely rewrote the script of this story? It works devastatingly like this. When the narcissist tries to humiliate you in public in front of other people, you don't defend yourself or counterattack. Instead, you look at the people around with an expression of genuine and caring concern and say something like, "Guys, have you noticed that John always acts like this when he's going through stress? I sincerely hope he's okay and gets help." Instantly, with that simple phrase, you've completely transformed the dynamic of the situation. He's no longer the powerful and intimidating predator. He's become the unstable and problematic character who clearly needs professional help. And you've transformed into the mature, balanced, and genuinely understanding person who's concerned about his mental well-being. This tactic is absolutely devastating because it directly attacks the central core of narcissistic identity. They simply can't psychologically deal with being seen as fragile, needy, problematic, or mentally unstable. It's like you've violently ripped off their mask of power and publicly revealed the scared and unbalanced child underneath. The most cruelly genius part, you do this with absolutely genuine compassion stamped on your face. There's not a trace of sarcasm, there's no malice, there's no revenge. You really seem worried and sympathetic about his deteriorated mental state. This leaves the narcissist in a psychologically impossible position. He can't attack someone who's showing sincere care without seeming even more unstable. And here's the devastating final touch. You publicly offer to help him. Do you want to talk about this privately? It seems like you're going through a really difficult time, and I get worried. The narcissist is completely disarmed and lost because any additional aggression only publicly confirms that he really has serious mental problems. But the fourth tactic, this one will teach you to use the narcissist's own pathological arrogance as a devastating weapon against himself. This fourth tactic is ingeniously perverse and psychologically brutal. You're going to agree and amplify everything the narcissist says about himself, but in a way so absurdly exaggerated it borders on the completely ridiculous. Freud identified with precision that the narcissistic ego has a fatal and devastating vulnerability. It's completely incapable of detecting when its own pathological grandiosity is being subtly satirized. It's like their irony detection system is completely defective and broken. Here's how to execute this tactic with devastating perfection. When the narcissist brags about some pathetic achievement, you don't disagree or minimize. On the contrary, you become visually impressed and add even more fuel to the fire. If he says he's the best salesperson in the company, you respond with exaggerated admiration. Wow, true. You're practically a revolutionary sales genius. It must be really difficult and frustrating to work with people so dramatically inferior to you. If he complains that nobody can understand him, you agree with theatrical intensity. Exactly. Truly exceptional people like you are always misunderstood by the masses. It's the heavy price of superior genius. The devastating cruelty is in the calculated subtlety. To external observers with half a brain, it becomes crystal clear that you're being sarcastic, but the narcissist, completely blinded by their own pathological vanity, interprets it as genuine and desperately needed validation. They begin making increasingly absurd and grandiose declarations, and you continue agreeing with exaggerated admiration. The psychological result: the narcissist exposes themselves as a completely ridiculous and pathetic character before everyone, while you maintain a totally serious expression of admiration. People around begin to quickly notice the dynamic, and the narcissist loses all social credibility without even realizing they're destroying themselves. The most devastatingly cruel part comes after. When someone comments on the narcissist's bizarre and strange behavior, you feign genuine concern. Gosh, did I overdo it with the compliments? I sincerely hope I didn't feed his ego too much. Maybe I should have been more cautious. You transform into the sensible and responsible person who accidentally exposed his madness for everyone to see. Wait until you know the fifth tactic. This one will show you how to use the narcissistic brain's own reward system against them, creating a devastating psychological dependency that you can completely control. The fifth tactic is psychologically addictive for the narcissist in a way that borders on scientific cruelty. You're going to create a calculated system of intermittent rewards that will literally leave them dependent and addicted to your approval like a drug. Freud studied intensively the mechanisms of pleasure and discovered something devastating. Completely unpredictable and sporadic rewards are infinitely more addictive than constant and predictable rewards. It's exactly this principle you're going to use as a psychological weapon against the narcissist. Transform them into a desperate lab rat for your validation. It works brutally effectively like this. Occasionally, very rarely, and in a completely unpredictable way, you give the narcissist exactly what they most desire: recognition, admiration, focused attention. But you do this in a totally unpredictable way, followed by long periods of complete cold indifference. For example, they talk about a work project and you, surprisingly, show genuine and intense interest. You ask detailed questions, praise specific aspects, show real admiration. Their brain registers this emotional victory and releases a massive dose of dopamine. But then, entire weeks of icy neutrality and total indifference. What happens next is psychologically devastating and completely predictable. The narcissist will begin trying more and more desperately to recreate that magical moment of validation. They'll intensify efforts pathetically, tell increasingly elaborate and exaggerated stories, try to impress you in increasingly desperate and transparent ways. The most cruelly genius part is that you're always in total control of the situation. You decide exactly when to give the dose of attention and when to completely withdraw it. The narcissist, accustomed to manipulating and controlling other people, suddenly finds themselves being psychologically manipulated without even realizing what's happening. And here's the psychological masterstroke. When someone asks why you're sometimes nice to them, you respond with simplicity. Well, everyone deserves a little kindness now and then, right? He's not a bad person deep down. You position yourself as the empathetic and understanding person, while they become the desperate emotional beggar. The devastating final result? The narcissist, who previously controlled you through cruel manipulation, now lives in constant and anxious hope for your next crumb of attention. They've become the pathetic dependent, and you've become the dealer of the only drug they really want. But the sixth tactic is where things get really interesting and disturbing. Prepare to learn how to use the narcissist's natural paranoia to make them completely self-destruct their own relationships. This sixth tactic is psychologically devastating and surgical. You're going to plant calculated seeds of doubt about how other people really see the narcissist, using their natural and deep paranoia to systematically destroy their support network. Freud identified with precision that underneath all the pathological external grandiosity, every narcissist carries a deep and paralyzing terror of being discovered as a complete fraud. This devastating insecurity is an open psychological wound that you can exploit with surgical precision. The execution is subtle but absolutely brutal in its effects. In casual and apparently innocent conversations, you mention small observations, carefully selected about other people's behavior toward the narcissist. Nothing direct or obvious, just insinuations planted with scientific precision. You know, yesterday Maria made a kind of strange face when you left the meeting room. It was probably just my imagination. Or the boss seemed kind of impatient when you were presenting your ideas. But it might have just been a bad day for him, right? You never state anything definitive or concrete. You always leave abundant room for doubt and interpretation. But the poisonous seed is planted deeply. The narcissist's paranoid brain will do all the rest of the devastating work, amplifying these small doubts until they become terrifying and obsessive certainties. What makes this tactic especially cruel is that you always maintain a convincing posture of concerned and observant friend. When the narcissist desperately asks what Maria really said or did, you respond with innocence. Oh, it wasn't anything specific or concrete. I'm probably interpreting it wrong anyway. You know her better than I do, so ignore my comment. Gradually, systematically, the narcissist begins obsessively questioning every social interaction, every look, every pause in conversation, every gesture from people around them. They become hypervigilant and paranoid, compulsively analyzing every micro-expression from those around them. And the more they question and investigate, the stranger and more paranoid they seem to others. The devastating result is completely predictable. The narcissist systematically destroys their own relationships through growing paranoia, pushing away people who could really support or tolerate them. And you? You gradually become the only trustworthy person they can confide in about their growing insecurities. But prepare yourself, because the seventh tactic will teach you something very few know: how to use their own narcissism to make them sabotage their most important achievements. The seventh tactic is a true work of psychological art. You're going to strategically encourage the narcissist to take their arrogance to such absurd extremes that it will inevitably destroy them professionally and socially. Freud observed with scientific precision that narcissists are completely incapable of establishing healthy limits for their own pathological grandiosity. They always need more recognition, always want to be more important, more recognized, more powerful, more admired. And you're going to use this self-destructive compulsion against them as a weapon. The strategy is apparently simple, but devastatingly effective. You're going to deliberately feed the narcissist's most destructive and irresponsible ambitions, encouraging them to make moves that seem brilliant and audacious in the short term, but are absolutely suicidal in the long term. When they mention a risky and irresponsible idea at work, you show yourself visually impressed. Wow, what a truly innovative vision. You always think outside the box in a revolutionary way. Most people simply wouldn't have the intellectual courage for something so audacious and visionary. When they consider confronting the boss imprudently, you add strategic fuel. Someone really needs to have the courage to speak the truth in this company. You've always been too brave to conform to mediocrity. That's what separates visionary leaders from followers. What you're doing psychologically is feeding precisely the self-destructive impulses that will annihilate them professionally and socially. The narcissist, addicted to your carefully controlled validation, interprets your encouragement as scientific confirmation that their most grandiose and irresponsible ideas are pure genius. The most cruelly brilliant part is that you can always deny any responsibility for the results. When their imprudent decisions explode spectacularly in their face, you show yourself genuinely surprised and deeply concerned. Wow, I really didn't imagine things would go in this devastating direction. I thought you had everything perfectly calculated and planned. The narcissist finds themselves trapped in a psychologically impossible position. They can't blame you, because you just believed in their potential. They can't publicly admit they made stupid and irresponsible decisions, because that would completely break their inflated ego. So they get trapped in a vicious cycle of self-sabotage, always desperately seeking to prove that their next grandiose ideas will compensate for previous failures. And you become the understanding and loyal confidant who always sincerely believed in their potential, even when they're systematically destroying themselves before your eyes. But the eighth tactic is where you learn to play with the narcissist's pathological need to be unique and special, transforming this need into a devastating psychological prison. The eighth tactic is psychologically isolating in an almost scientific way. You're going to make the narcissist feel so special and superiorly unique that they will voluntarily cut themselves off from all meaningful relationships in their life. Freud discovered something fundamental about the narcissistic psyche. They have a compulsive and insatiable need to feel unique in the universe. They don't just want to be better than other people. They desperately need to be incomparable, misunderstood, too special to be understood by common people. And you're going to transform this pathological need into a devastating psychological trap. The execution is subtle, but absolutely devastating. You begin treating the narcissist as if they were an intellectual and emotional rarity that others simply can't comprehend due to their mental limitation. You really think on such a different and superior level to common people. It must be genuinely lonely to be so intellectually evolved. Gradually, with calculated patience, you plant the idea that they're too special to effectively relate to mentally limited people. When they complain about conflicts with friends or family, you shake your head with deep understanding. It's completely natural for friction to arise. Truly exceptional people like you always have natural difficulty connecting with the limited mental level of most people. The psychological poison is in the apparently positive validation. You're not criticizing the narcissist in any way. You're elevating them to a pedestal so absurdly high that they completely lose the ability to form real and meaningful human connections. They begin automatically interpreting every disagreement as irrefutable proof of their superiority, not as an opportunity for growth or self-knowledge. The cruelly genius part is that you always offer solutions that systematically deepen the isolation. Maybe you need to find people who are really on your intellectual level. Most people simply won't be able to keep up with your superior reasoning. The result is psychologically devastating and completely predictable. The narcissist, convinced of their unique and incomparable superiority, systematically pushes away everyone who could offer different perspectives or genuine emotional support. They become an island of pathological grandiosity, dependent only on your validation, to confirm that their growing loneliness is, in fact, a sign of intellectual superiority. And when they finally realize they're completely isolated and alone, you're there, the only person who really understands them in their complexity, having orchestrated all their social isolation while seeming to just recognize their unique exceptionality. But the ninth tactic. This one will reveal how to transform the narcissist's obsessive need to always be right into a tool to expose all their contradictions and hypocrisies. The ninth tactic is systematic psychological documentation. You're going to meticulously archive every opinion, promise, and grandiose declaration of the narcissist, creating a database of contradictions that you can strategically use to destroy their credibility. Freud knew that narcissists are fundamentally incapable of maintaining ideological consistency because their truth constantly changes as it suits their ego's interests. They constantly rewrite reality to fit the narrative that favors them in the moment. Here's how to execute this tactic with surgical precision. When the narcissist makes a grandiose or categorical declaration today, you just smile neutrally and mentally note every detail. Weeks later, when they say exactly the opposite with the same arrogant conviction, you innocently ask, "How interesting. I remember perfectly that last week you said exactly the opposite with quite a bit of conviction. What specifically made you change your mind so radically?" The cruelly effective beauty of this tactic is that you never directly accuse, you just remember with photographic precision. The narcissist can't attack your memory without seeming completely mentally unstable. Gradually, they lose all social credibility, exposed publicly as someone whose convictions change with the wind as it suits them. You become the person with perfect memory who gently points out inconsistencies, not out of malice, but out of genuine curiosity about their changes in perspective. The narcissist gets trapped between admitting they were wrong before, destroying the ego, or admitting they're wrong now, also destroying the ego. Mental documentation becomes a devastating weapon because narcissists compulsively lie, including to themselves, about their own previous positions. Your perfect memory forces them to confront the reality of their pathological inconsistency. The 10th tactic forces brutal confrontation. You're going to force the narcissist to confront the real consequences of their actions, amplifying every negative result until they can no longer deny or distort reality. When their irresponsible decisions cause real problems, you don't minimize or dramatize. You document with devastating clinical precision. So, objectively recapping, Your decision to aggressively confront the client resulted in the definitive loss of the contract. 3 people had to work overtime to try to fix the situation, and now we have to completely rebuild the relationship from scratch. Is that the current situation? You don't criticize or attack, you just reflect reality in undeniable high definition. The narcissist, accustomed to distorting consequences and blaming others, finds themselves forced to confront the real and documented impact of their actions without psychological escape. The tactic is brutal because it removes all mental exits that narcissists use to avoid responsibility. There's no way to blame others, no way to minimize, no way to reinterpret when the facts are exposed with surgical precision. Freud knew that narcissists desperately need an audience to exist psychologically. This tactic systematically removes all audience from the narcissist's pathetic performances, leaving them talking to emptiness. When they start a grandiose story in a group, you discreetly redirect the conversation. Wow, how interesting, John. But guys, did you see that news about... It's not rude or obvious, just strategically indifferent to their show. Gradually, the narcissist realizes that nobody pays attention to their elaborate performances anymore. They intensify efforts increasingly desperately, become more obvious and pathetic. But the audience has already learned to follow your subtle leadership, elegantly ignoring every attempt at drama. The narcissist finds themselves talking to walls, their stories interrupted by more interesting conversations, their monologues ignored. The lack of audience destroys them psychologically because it removes their primary source of validation. You orchestrate this without ever seeming cruel, just naturally redirecting to more relevant topics. The narcissist can't complain without seeming needy and desperate for attention. The final tactic is the most devastating of all. You completely stop reacting to anything the narcissist does. Not with anger, not with indifference, with the absolute emptiness of emotional non-existence. They speak, you don't respond or register. They provoke, you're not emotionally present. They explode, you remain in a state of total emptiness. It's as if they've become a ghost that you see, but that doesn't affect your reality in any way. This is the final psychological death for a narcissist, realizing they've become completely irrelevant to someone they once controlled. There's no anger to feed their victim narrative, no fear to validate their imaginary power, just the absolute emptiness of non-existence. The narcissist tries to escalate, screams louder, becomes more aggressive, but it's like screaming in the vacuum of space. No sound, no echo, no reaction. You're physically present, but emotionally non-existent to them. When you master these 12 devastating tactics, something extraordinary happens. The narcissist doesn't just lose power over you, they lose their very sense of reality. Forced to confront their true insignificance, stripped of their masks, isolated from their support network, they become exactly what they always feared being: common, flawed, and completely powerless over anything. And you? You rise from the ashes of who you used to be, transformed into someone who will never again be vulnerable to narcissistic manipulation. Because now you don't just know the game, you are the absolute master of it. As Freud once said, the revenge that hurts most is not the one that destroys the body, but the one that reveals the soul. These tactics don't physically destroy the narcissist. They reveal the pathetic truth behind the grandiose mask. And that is the cruelest revenge of all, forcing someone who lives on illusions to confront the brutal reality of who they really are. Now you have the power. Use it wisely.